because I'm going to start about the Olympics, but I'm talking about the London Olympics and the wonderful public relations that the army got out of that. But I would argue that wasn't planned in advance. It was pretty fortuitous. It was because a private company managed to mess it all up. And that's really atypical, or at least not the messing up isn't atypical, but the army stepping in to date is fairly atypical. And that there's a military industrial complex out there, but it's the companies that are having the real advantage and taking really advantage of what's going on. And companies are taking over, and I think it came up this morning slightly, some of the functions that until today have been largely, at least in the last century or so, largely confined to the organised militaries. The companies have been lobbying like mad. Barnaby has just talked about the national security strategy and how most of the threats facing the UK and the world actually are non-military or don't need a military solution. But somehow we've still got those aircraft carriers. But we're also, because companies are still arguing, not least for the idea of jobs, that they still need to keep building those. But the companies have also been very clever and are arguing for more funding and for more research. And one of the ways they're doing that is saying, look, we can produce a commercial solution to some of those other threats. So they're moving into cyber security or the kind of high-tech solutions, the UAVs and drones. They are moving into new areas as well as lobbying constantly for more money for the old. And the companies are lobbying not only in the UK and at national government level, they're very cleverly been lobbying at European Union level. And they've very cleverly got across the idea that if you have a devolved government in Scotland, you need a kind of mini UK setup based in Edinburgh. You need all the armed forces, you need all the equipment up there replicated. The whole idea that this is the way you do it is permeating at all levels. And of course, if you can get the idea replicated in Europe, if you can get the idea replicated in Scotland as well as in the UK, there's more money for companies. They're arguing that very heavily, so they can kind of push that way. But they're pushing that way, but at the same time, they are taking more work on that used to be done by the military and governments. The military budget, like other budgets, has been largely frozen, but there is going to be a small increase shortly. That increase isn't going on the armed forces that people have been talking about. That increase is being preserved for the equipment budget. So while the armed forces spending is going down, the equipment budget is going up. There's been a lot of talk recently about the privatisation of the actual buying structure within the Ministry of Defence. So there's a lot of talk there about not only the companies selling to the Ministry of Defence, but a consortium of companies doing the buying for the Ministry of Defence, something that's called GOCO, which is government-owned, company-operated. That idea was apparently the structure that got the Olympic Stadium built so quickly and allegedly under budget, although the budget sort of mysteriously went up over the years. But whether or not this goes ahead, this idea of the companies running the game as well as selling to the government, I don't know. There's suggestions in the Financial Times yesterday that there were big conflicts of interest, because obviously one company doesn't want another company to know its secrets. Also, the UK would be first in the world to do this, and the Americans are not totally on board. But that is one very extreme way in which companies are going into areas which were previously reserved to the military and to the civilians who work in the Ministry of Defence. So that's the buying of military equipment. Another area that came up in the workshop just before lunch, of course, is they've privatised the recruitment of the armed forces with a computer that doesn't work. But that might be one of the reasons people have been told that recruitment is slightly in the doldrums at the moment because their computer system isn't working. Then they've been increasing use over the last decade or so of personnel taking on roles that were previously undertaken by members of the armed forces. The old-fashioned mercenaries gave way to contractors and to private military and security companies that are listed on stock exchanges. There's a proliferation of them. They undertake vast range of activities, from things very innocuous like cooking at bases and things like that, to armed duties. So it's a huge range of duties they take. Recently, it's moved from just being on land actions to also taking on maritime patrols in the Indian Ocean and anti-piracy measures. And this is very, very difficult for us to get a handle on or to control, or even to think where you begin to control it. Even governments, when they've wanted to do something about it after there's been a scandal, as I think Jack Straw did as Foreign Secretary in 2002, have found it virtually impossible to do anything because the range of activities is so great. They are now, the current government, the coalition government, finally decided to hand over the regulation to a self-regulation by the companies themselves. So that's another area. They have privatised, and now they've handed over the self-regulation to ADS, which is the prime trade industry body for aerospace, defence and space. So this privatisation is coming in everywhere, where the military at one point used to be. Now, this is a blurring activities, blurring of responsibilities, and it's very difficult to see how some of it can be controlled or held to account. The companies themselves, where are either, if they're a private company, they're obviously making money for their directors. Where they're a public listed company, as many of them are, they are making money for shareholders. But that is their prime aim. It's much less clear how they can be held to account by, for instance, Parliament, or through anything like freedom of information requests. Some of these are commercial now and beyond the realms that the actions of the Ministry of Defence and the armed forces themselves would be. So there's a lot of questions out there, and I'm not entirely sure how it impacts on some of the rest of today, and talking about the military coming into your areas. But in a way, that feels to me like it might be a bit of a smokescreen while all this other stuff is going on behind the scenes. The other stuff, as Barnaby pointed out, the huge amount of money on fighter aircraft, for instance, which have very little purpose that I can see. That's the kind of front end. Behind the scenes, it's being privatised with companies making money for their shareholders. Another point just worth raising, and I hope we can really get a discussion in the discussion section next, is that some of the toughest questions are being asked by the least expected people. Sir John Stanley, who's a former Conservative Defence Minister, and he now chairs the Committees on Arms Export Controls, looking at arms exports, but he first passed my radar in the early 2000s when he started asking questions in the Foreign Affairs Committee about the privatisation and the increasing use of private companies to take on what was being done by the armed forces. At that point he was saying, if you want these things done, we should have more people in the army. We shouldn't be letting them go to all sorts of commercial concerns. But he asked very rigorous questions on the arms trade now, and he's certainly somebody who I wouldn't have expected to be asking these questions, but he's very conscious of this kind of clash between the military and commercial concerns. Others who ask questions sometimes, or in fact another strange group, are the kind of extreme free marketeers, because they think some of these companies are getting too many contracts from the government and taking the money and not producing the goods, as it were. And they think there's a great deal of feather bedding going on. So I think there's some strange potential allies out there, but how we go about challenging this, I don't know. Probably we're not going to be able to challenge these kind of technical problems and these kind of details until we challenge the whole idea of militarism and the whole kind of way that we look for military solutions to problems, because a lot of these activities wouldn't need to be taking place if that wasn't happening. But in the meantime, I think we're letting some of the companies run the agenda, go to Edinburgh, go to Brussels and tell people that they do need their own military capabilities there.